questions at the end, and we will be finished by 6:30 p.m. UK time. So just a little word about other seminars coming up as well. Some of you in the UK know that we have a lot of strikes coming up. So unfortunately, I can't confirm whether these talks will happen on those strike days. If the strikes do happen, unfortunately, the talks won't happen. But at the moment, we're hoping that negotiations happen and things can be resolved, and we won't have to do all the strikes. But we'll wait and see. But certainly, we have Raluca, who's here tonight. We're very lucky. Raluca Soreanu, who will be giving a book launch as well on a book that she has out with Jacob Starberg and Jenny Wilner, entitled Forensic Dialogues on Trauma and Catastrophe. And that book launch will be over Zoom on the 8th of March at the same time, at 5 o'clock. So we're really pleased to have her give that book launch. And then we have on the 15th of March, another Essex academic, Orsolia Lucas, will be talking. And we don't quite know yet what she will be talking about, but we'll find out and we'll let you know. So please do join us for these events, and hopefully more of them as well. And just keep abreast of what's happening, because it's lovely to have so many people. Yes, just to say, and thank you, Margaret, in the chat for reminding me that this event will be recorded, and it reminds me I need to record now.
Exactly.
I'm going to do that now. Let me see, where can I, do I have, the problem is if I have the function, sometimes I have the power to do it, and sometimes record, yes, okay. So
Recording
I'm pressing
in
record,
progress.
it's recording now. So any of you who, for whatever reason, don't want to have your face on the screen in this recording, please, if you're asking questions, you could write in the chat perhaps. But it will be available for those of us people who couldn't make the event or who want to listen to the event. So yes. Raluca, if your connection is good enough, would you like to introduce Carla and Earl?
Thank you so much, Emilia, and I do hope people can hear me all right, because I keep getting these messages that my connection is unstable. So good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I am Raluca Soreanu. I am a professor of psychoanalytic studies at the department, and I'm also a psychoanalyst at the same Psychoanalytic Society as our author tonight, Carla Penna. We are members of the Círculo Psicanalítico do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So I have many intersecting worlds with Carla, and I'm delighted to introduce her and her very, very interesting and important book tonight, which will be then commented by Earl Hopper. So I know that it's also a special occasion because we have so many colleagues from Brazil and Brazilian networks, psychoanalytic, group analytics. So welcome, a special welcome to you as well. Sejam bem-vindos. We are cultivating our connections with Brazil in all ways we can. So be welcome, all of you. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. So again, it's an occasion dedicated to Carla Penna's book, From Crowd Psychology to the Dynamics of Large Groups, which I strongly recommend to all of you. You can get the book from Routledge, and I know Emilia will be sharing the link with all of you. Carla Penna is a PhD and a psychoanalyst and group analyst in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She is a member of the scientific committee of the Group Analytic Society International. She is a former president of the Brazilian Group Psychotherapy Association and Group Analytic Psychotherapy Society of the state of Rio de Janeiro, and a former visiting professor of medical psychology at UERJ. So welcome to you, Carla, and thank you for being with us tonight. And I will also introduce Earl Hopper, who will kindly comment on Carla's book tonight. So Earl Hopper, PhD, is a psychoanalyst, group analyst, and organizational consultant in private practice in London. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Group Psychotherapy Association, an honorary member of the Group Analytic Society International, and an honorary member of the Institute of Group Analysis. And he's a former president of the International Association for Group Psychotherapy and Group Processes, and also, of course, the author of many books and articles in psychoanalysis, group psychoanalysis, group analysis, and sociology. And he's also the editor of New International Library of Group Analysis. So it is a pleasure to give the floor first to Carla for around half an hour, and then around 20 minutes or so, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion, and Emilia and myself will pick up questions from the chat, will give you the floor to ask questions. So Carla, the floor is yours. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you. I'm grateful to Professor Raluca Soreanu and the University of Essex Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies for organizing this event to launch my book, edited for the new International Library of Group Analysis by Routledge. The event is being live streamed by the Interinstitutional Laboratory of Intersubjective Studies and Contemporary Psychoanalysis from São Paulo University and São Paulo Catholic University, under the leadership of Professor Marina Ribeiro and Professor Elisa Sintra, who are among us. It's a pleasure to be among colleagues from so many countries with whom I share similar interests in the company of my editor and friend, Dr. Earl Hopper, who will comment on my book. I'm also deeply grateful to Professor Claudia Garcia, who supported this project from the early days at the doctoral program of the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro in psychoanalysis and culture. For me, it's fundamental to mention Hopper's and Garcia's support as thinkers attuned to the transdisciplinary thinking. Both were influenced by many masters, such as Norbert Elias, or Hopper worked with him, and Eli Tsaresky, who oriented Claudia in her PhD. In different ways, they share with me some of what they learned and built from them. Some of you are students of the department, and I have been following before Bob Hinshelwood and Carl Filio retired. I hope that the reflective and critical thinking provided by your teachers at the university plants seeds for further thoughts and books. My book offers in 10 chapters and an epilogue transdisciplinary research on the history of the study of social formations, ranging from the 19th century crowd psychology in France and 20th century Freudian mass psychology, including the developments in critical theory, to the study of the psychodynamics of contemporary large groups. The research relies on the relevance of Koch-Zimmel study of forms of association and Norbert Elias' analysis of individualization processes and his concept of figuration in the study of individual society relations. Elias' ideas are in the background of the whole book. The framework provided by process sociology favors thinking in terms of interdependencies in individual society relations, pointing to a necessary shift from a society of individuals to a society of persons. This epistemology was fundamental for Fuchs to conceive group analysis in the 1940s. The book introduces and discusses the group analytic historical path, particularly in connection with the study of large groups and investigations of the social unconscious theory. In this route, the book revisits the importance of the Northfield experiments the early work on group relations, exploring as well contemporary research on the basic assumption group, especially Hopper's theory of incohesion, aggregation, massification as a fourth basic assumption. Thus, intertwining riddles and passions with my curiosity in inquiring spirit, I developed my research, presenting new perspectives to the investigation of our contemporary crowds, masses, and large groups. Moreover, considering the current socioeconomic, psychological, and political challenges, my book enables the reader to map out the field of the unconscious life of crowds and groups, illuminating the darkness of 21st century collective movements. Phenomena involving large number of persons have permeated history for centuries in the forms of mobs, crowds, masses, riots, and other experiences in which people shared collective beliefs. From the earliest record cases, for example, the dancing plague in Strasbourg, the French Revolution mobs, the Luddites uprisings in England, and crowd manifestations in 19th century in France, several hypotheses have been formulated to explain people's unexpected behavior in different social formations. In the last decade of the 19th century, when deep socioeconomic and political transformations were taking place, the unconventional behavior and the potential threat of mobs and crowds drew the attention of scholars interested in deciphering their psychology. Thus, in the clash between liberal and conservative forces, new disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and criminology paved the way for the birth of the study of crowd psychology. Fruttard and Le Bon in France, and Lombroso and Ciguelli in Italy. The characterization of crowds as irrational, savage, and pathological prevailed in the conservative thinking of the 19th century. Le Bon was the most often important of these scholars. He abandoned the views that used to consider crowd movements from a criminal point of view to look for a psychological explanation for their behavior. His works were read by Mussolini and Hitler and by Democrats like de Gaulle. Le Bon's talent seems to be linked to his ability to capture and translate into words the zeitgeist of his time, that is, the social situation, fears, and aspirations characteristic of the late 19th century. Theories about social hierarchies, race, and lower forms of evolution shaped his ideas. He imported from Salpêtrière and Nancy schools the concepts of imitation, suggestion, hypnosis, and contagion to discuss crowd psychology. He was convinced that the 19th century heralded the advent of a new era, the era of crowds. Freud's mass psychology and its legacy. In the 20th century, at the dawn of mass society, with the emergence of mass men portrayed by Ortega y Gasset, individuals were transformed in atomized masses, fascinated by illusory power of their leaders. Just after World War I, Freud wrote Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, transforming the views that used to give importance to hypnotic suggested features of crowds and replacing them with unconscious processes, identifications, libidinal ties, and ideal agencies. Freud's work on the masses highlights the link that binds the individual and the social, and necessarily involves the other as a model, as an object, as a helper, as an opponent. Freud's mass psychology foreshadowed the way unscrupulous leaders will influence and rule the masses. The concerns with collective behavior thus converted into needs to find ways to control and govern the masses. Thus, what was feared in the 19th century began to be manipulated, controlled, and disciplined in the 20th century. From this perspective, it seems that the solution from mass rebellion depended mainly on the knowledge of its psychology. Freud fired a fatal shot at modern dichotomies that ignored the interdependencies between individual and society relations. This view remained overshadowed for decades in classic psychoanalysis. However, it was active in the 1920s and 1930s, and Freudo-Marxist psychoanalysis, contributing to the Frankfurt School studies on fascist, demagogic propaganda, and authoritarian personality in the 20th century. Thus, after a conservative phase in the 19th century and a later phase marked by the consolidation and affirmation of mass society in the 20th century, mass psychology study suffered a true swing to the left, converting into a critical instrument to capture the movements of mass society and their leaders. It fostered the creation of critical analysis to understand collective behaviors and totalitarianism as a break on forms of oppression and voluntary servitude, in allusion to La Boétie from the 16th century. After the World War II, Adorno discussed the Freudian theory and the fascist model of propaganda, fascist manipulation in the service of charismatic leaders who made use of libidinal bonds and demagogic techniques to exercise control over masses. All these conscious and unconscious processes reveal how, through regression and identifications, and adherence affect a malicious egalitarianism emerges in the in-group, leading its members to disdain the superego functions in favor of conforming to the group's ideals, projecting aggressiveness on the out-group. For Saint-Preux, Freud's work on mass psychology was fundamental for the understanding and development of the 20th century history. The thesis defended by Arendt, Elias, Canetti, Adorno, and Sartre would never have been formulated without Freud's work on the masses. Further, we can observe and confirm historically that the phenomena of masses, more than reproducing the zeitgeist or even the habitus of a historical period, either 19th century or 20th century, represents, manifests, and embodies the restraints and constraints that are the heart of the social unconscious of persons living in a certain culture at a certain time. The development of the work with groups. During the Second World War, at Northfield Hospital, 2 experiments left an important legacy for group work in England. The tendencies outlined in Northfield point to the post-war emergence of 2 main different streams of psychoanalytic-oriented groups. The first experiment, conducted by Rickman and Bion, work with leaderless groups, led to the establishment of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in 1946. It also permitted Bion to conceptualize the basic assumption group and work group theory. The second experiment relates to the development of therapeutic communities and to Fuchs' approach to small group work, which led to the creation in collaboration with Elias of the Group Analytic Society in 1952. This history, I'm in depth with Tom Harrison, who is in this moment attending this event. So I'm really grateful for you, Tom, because you enlightened something that was a shadow for us in Brazil and Latin America for decades, especially for my masters, people with whom I learned with groups. Nobody knew exactly what happened in Northfield until your book was launched. The transformative context of the 1960s and 70s conferred a new zeitgeist for the development of group work in India. The impetus inherited from the Northfield experience, combined with new social cultural perspectives, favored innovations in healthcare that led to advances in group work, especially the development of large groups. In 1965, at Halliwick Hospital, Krieger and Patrick DeMare established a new culture in ward and community meetings through work in large groups, starting in 1966 to convene them. In its early days, large group work was underdeveloped, not integrated into one single perspective. Moreover, group analytic perspectives overlapped with those from the group relations tradition. By that time, group relations professionals were involved in the development of Leicester conferences and the A.K. Rice Institute in the U.S., underpinning and learning about leadership in groups. In their framework, they included experiences in large groups. In parallel, members of the Group Analytic Society in London were working in large groups in various settings. The first large group cohort in group analysis was influenced by a mixture of Freudian, Kleinian, Bionian, and Foucauldian theoretical approaches. However, whereas the group relations field, grounded in Bionian group theories, built a more structured and unified frame for their work, in group analysis there was just one single group analytic approach to large group work. Despite the differences, his pioneers cherish a kind of group analytic spirit. Constructed large groups offer opportunities for the study of regression, primary processes, and early phases of unconscious life, expanding the comprehension that common defenses against mental pain of denial, splitting, and projection into others have immense social consequences when used by a whole group of individuals. Participations in large groups refers to self-study and contributes to broadening the understanding of oneself, enabling persons to learn from experience about socially unconscious processes co-created through interpersonal, and transpersonal interactions. Moreover, in large groups, we observe the emergence of power relations, struggles for leadership, polarization, and group grouping. Inspired by ancient Greek amphitheatres, DeMare glimpses large group interactions. His idea has to do with the principle of koinonia, which refers to the development of impersonal fellowship, a culture of togetherness and communion. A large group offers a structure or a medium for linking the inner world with social cultural dimensions in which interpersonal relationships take place. In this direction, large group work points to the possibility of humanizing society and developing citizenship through dialogue. Large groups undeniably trigger strong emotions and frustrate libidinal needs by eliciting primitive and psychotic mechanisms, as Krieger, Turke, Hopper, and others have investigated extensively. However, and almost paradoxically, large group work creates safe spaces for collective self-reflection, transforming the unconscious collective processes that had previously been displayed as thoughtless behavior in the 19th century crowds or blind followership in the 20th century totalitarian masses into new forms of thinking and dialogue for persons and communities. In this sense, it's clear that large group work is a theoretical and technical research tool to broaden the contemporary understanding of the psychodynamics of persons when gathered in large numbers. Bio experiences in groups became a landmark in the conceptualization of unconscious processes that concur to demonstrate the ubiquitous regressive phenomenon that influence people in groups. Psychoanalysts, group relations, and group analytic professionals have been discussing basic assumption group and work group configurations since Bion outlined his theory. From observations in large group settings, attempts to postulate new basic assumptions were undertaken. At the Tavistock Institute in the 1970s, Pierre Turquet privileged the phenomenology of individual experiences in large groups. Through the theory of oneness, Turquet discusses threats to the individual's identity and defenses associated with primary envy, such as the tendency to fuse and acquire homogeneity in large groups. In 1996, Lawrence Bainbridge Good postulated the meanness theory as a fifth basic assumption. The authors observed in large group participants of group relations conferences a denial of the idea of a group and a tendency to withdraw and isolation. This is very compacted for the presentation. Hopper's incohesion, aggregation, massification theory as a fourth basic assumption involves a paradigm shift in the study of basic assumptions proposed by Bion and contributions from authors such as Turquet and Lawrence Bainbridge Good. His theory was developed from the end of the Cold War to the recrudescence of fundamentalist thinking, terrorism, racism, immigration, and the intensification of socio-economic problems when expectations regarding a globalized and democratic world diminished, stressing uncertainty, fragmentation, and fear. Within a postmodern and transdisciplinary perspective that shifted attention from cohesion to incohesion in groups. Hopper's theory captured exactly these psychosocial fractures, these conscious and unconscious traumatic experiences, enabling the postulation of a fourth basic assumption. Incohesion theory proposes a shift from postulations based on Kleinian-Bionian model of mind that derives from the vet instinct and favors primary end. In drive theory, it is impossible to conceptualize an anxiety more primitive than the schizoid. Consequently, if innate malign envy reflects the action of the dead instinct, one cannot postulate basic assumptions that are more primitive than dependency. However, by making use of a group analytic relational perspective, we can conceptualize a fourth basic assumption. However, in order to do so, we need to understand helplessness in terms of failed dependency, abandoning the assumption of an innate malignant envy. Trauma and the fear of annihilation are thus primary, and the emergence of envy secondary, and in a sense, defensive against horrible anxieties. Hopper's theory merges primitive social formations from sociology, such as aggregates and masses, with group analysis, Bion's basic assumptions, and object relations theory. In addition, based on discussions that range from sociology to systems theory, as well on his clinical experience with traumatized patients, Hopper says that it's only when a social system, a society, a city, or a village is traumatized that it shows processes that may be described as a regression from the complex to the simple and analyzed as a group. This is a very important statement because he says traumatized societies become like groups, and traumatized groups become like people. Therefore, it's only under these circumstances that an isomorphism between persons, groups, and social systems can be postulated. This is a very strong difficulty that psychoanalysts that work in the psychosocial or with sociology face. And this is a very important statement from Hopper. Hopper innovates pointing to the ubiquitous role of helplessness and experiences of failed dependence, to inadequate holding and insufficient containment in association with the fear of annihilation. Incohesion, aggregation, massification is a manifestation of the intrapsychic phenomenology of the fear of annihilation and defensive response to its experiences of failed dependence. The phenomenology of the fear of annihilation is marked by the development of psychotic anxieties associated with intrapsychic fission and fragmentation in aggregation states, in oscillation with psychotic anxieties associated with fusion and confusion and massification. He will be able to explain more later if you need some more explanations about his theory. As Hopper theory demonstrates, the history of the 20th century discloses how the incohesion theory underpins and legitimizes aggregation social-cultural states characterized by individualism, narcissism, isolation, withdrawal, and oscillation with massification social-cultural states characterized by a minimal degree of differentiation, adhesive identification, and styles of communication, feeling, and thinking resembling cults. Fundamentalism and scapegoating, as observed in totalitarian groups, are the twin pillars of massification. Incohesion theory provides new frames of reference to explore intrapersonal, interpersonal, transpersonal, and transgenerational traumatic experiences, being relevant as well for the study of identity and social identities, which is being so focused today. Large groups today. In the last decades of the 20th century, we experienced the inflation of the private home to the detriment of the public sphere, the prevalence of narcissistic culture, and the exacerbation of individualism. Today, life in society is facing a decrease in democratic leadership, the recrudescence of fundamentalist thinking, displacements of Foucauldian biopower, and the emergence of necropolitics. We witness millions of persons submitted to humiliation, shame, disrespect, exclusion, and other forms of systemic violence. Contemporaneity is thus forging new dimensions of traumatic experiences for persons, groups, and societies that characterize an increase in incohesion processes. Nevertheless, perhaps as a sign of personal and collective resistance, we are also witnessing the emergence of new struggles for recognition, demands for dignity, and politics of identity. In this direction, public and performative assemblies and attempt to work through collective wounds, as Professor Raluca Soreanu wrote in her book, are being very important. And movements as Black Lives Matters are suggesting glimpses of hope for persons and groups. From the knowledge gained in my research, I ask, after almost 2 centuries of investigations in collective processes, were we able to advance in the research of social formations? What happened to the threatening power of crowds? What is the impact of the democratic recession, the resurgence of right-wing politics, and the populist surge on the unconscious life of groups? What is the relationship between the new social, political, and economic reality and the increase of incohesion processes in association with identity politics? Can the theories discussed in my book clarify the psychodynamics of some of these contemporary collective processes? Today, large group work seems crucial to face contemporary challenges by fostering dialogue in communities that might function as an antidote against social massification. Through the work in large groups, it's possible to get in contact with what was socially unconscious, transmitted, denied, and encapsulated, facilitating the working through of collective traumas and intergroup conflicts in the social political arena. Yet, given the contemporary hardships, for some, the idea of working with large groups leads to ambivalence and disbelief, and the possibility of using the large group as a tool to transform relationships among large number of persons. Indeed, the idea of learning from experience in large groups seems to be just a little sparkle of togetherness amidst the uncertain fellowship witnessed in the increasing incohesion processes of our century. Moreover, considering the horrible war in Europe and COVID-19 transformations, I wonder if the fellowship envisaged by large group work will find the strength to face the struggles posed by today's world. When I was concluding my book, I was with all of these questions in my mind, and I didn't know how to end it. But I found a path, and that I will share with you. In order to do so, it seems necessary to find in an almost forgotten area of our souls a space to develop mature hope. To find this inner space, I sought inspiration in Pasolini's visit to Dante's Inferno, where the poet noticed the tiny light from fireflies. In an outspoken article, The Vacuum of Power, also known as the Article of Fireflies, published in 1975 in Corriere della Sera, Pasolini analyzed the decline of old fascists and the rise of a permissive neo-fascists in Italy in the 70s. To develop his critique, Pasolini used a metaphor, the sudden disappearance of fireflies from the fields of Italy due to pollution. Based on Pasolini's metaphor, the philosopher Didi Huberman wrote Survival of the Fireflies to discuss the importance of the survival of experience as a form of political resistance in dark times. We might imagine that because of their fragility, the fireflies would be certainly condemned to disappear. However, as D.D. Huberman highlights, the live firefly dance can take place only in the middle of the darkness, where it creates a dance of desire that forms a community of survival, a community of resistance. Therefore, as D.D. Huberman states, the ability to recognize a resistance in the smallest firefly becomes a light for all thought. Through D.D. Huberman's idea, it's clear how the metaphor, in Hopper's terms, the personification of the surviving fireflies, describes precisely the relevance and the meaning of the group and the album. From the heroic times at Northfield to the contemporary experiences. Group analytic professionals, attitudes and experiences, but I can say people from social science, from psychoanalysis, from many other fields might understand that professional attitudes and experiences, especially through large group work, which is the focus of my research, represents sparkling lights of understanding and thinking to face the darkness before personal and social suffering. Almost as if beyond daydreaming, I wonder if, like tiny human fireflies, we all can become stronger and develop a bioluminescent skill to illuminate the darkness of 21st century struggles. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carla. Look, everybody's applauding, and I can join them for sure. And it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Earl Hopper, who will comment on the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Carla. Again, I think that was a lovely introduction to your book. I'm aware that we don't have that much time if we're going to honor our commitment to the large group, the nascent large group that we have here. So I'll limit my remarks just a bit and confine myself more to a briefer commentary. It's especially important that I don't entirely know who I'm talking to. I suppose you didn't either. We have many names and faces, and we're trying to be intimate on the screen, but actually there are so many names and faces that are half known, half not known, and I suppose it goes both ways. You're a matter of considerable projection on my part, but I'm prepared to withdraw my projections in the discussions if you let yourself be known more fully. My relationship with Carla is an important aspect of our working, working as an editor, rather committed editor, rather perhaps overzealous, Carla may have felt at some time on this book. Carla and I understand one another. We have very similar backgrounds. We're professionally, that is, we're sociologists, we're psychoanalysts, and we're group analysts, psychoanalytical group therapists. And not many people have, I suppose, bothered to have such extensive trainings, all their lives doing one kind of course or another. But we identify with these three aspects of our project: sociology, group analysis, and psychoanalysis. And what that means is that we've read very similar material and have been influenced by very similar people. So we can talk together and kind of have an understanding of what we're after. And much of that can be seen in the study of large groups and in working with them. Let me sort of contextualize the book in a way. And, when Lionel Krieger edited his book in 1975, and really about 25 years later, Stanley Schneider and Chaim Weinberg edited their book, each on the large group, collecting chapters from various people who were working in slightly different traditions, but with constructed large groups and so on. One of the things that was missing was really a historical perspective, not just in the literature itself, reviewing the literature, going back beyond Rickman, beyond Turkey, and so on, back to crowds and so on. Those two books, for one reason or another, really didn't capture that material. Mainly, I think, because Krieger's book, you might say, overemphasized the work that had been done in therapeutic community contexts and various kinds of hospital settings and so on, not back to the study of industrialization. Now, Carla's book does not have that failing. Carla's book really starts with the crowd phenomenon, not the constructed large group phenomenon. And that's very, very important as punctuating this contribution. The second thing is that most of our work, as all of us here know, our institutions and our relationships with one another and our writing is still, unfortunately, riven with jealousy and envy and competition, and what's more important, with considerable contempt and rather limited understanding of the various points of view that exist within our field. We don't yet make much effort really to understand the point of view of the other and the nature of their work. And that's certainly still true in the relations between group analysts and group relations people writing about large groups in particular. I would say that Carla has taken great pains, not just in a personal way, but intellectually, to avoid that particular problem. And to the extent that I know the literature or know the perspectives of these different sections, Carla has really taken steps to honor these different perspectives as clearly as she possibly could do. Now, I would say that from my own point of view, I go back to, I suppose in some ways, my interest in large groups preceded my experience of large groups. And they go back to close work and association, mentorship, friendliness with Norbert Elias, who in a way brought me to England. I came to England in 1962, partly to work with him as a kind of sociologist who accepted the importance of psychoanalysis. And he was very respectful towards the psychoanalytical project. And we met in Washington, D.C. before I got on the ship in New York. The truth of the matter is that he then told me, well, I'm sorry, Earl, I'm on my way to Ghana, where I've just accepted a professorship of sociology. But when he came back a year or so later, we became friendly again and continued to explore our interests. Now, the main thing that I remember from my meeting him, we were in Washington, D.C. at a conference of the International Sociological Association, as a matter of fact, having tea or a glass of wine each was hard to find in Washington, D.C. in 1962, tea or white wine. But I remember getting into a discussion and feeling greatly validated and respected by Norbert, because I made the point I was an advanced graduate student, you could say, in sociology, that I didn't understand why the fathers of sociology, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, seemed to be so often the objects of splitting among sociologists in various languages around the world, and especially Durkheim, the father of sociology in a way, the French sociologist, split off from the German project. And he didn't explain why the splitting took place, but he recognized that it was so and accepted that it was so. And we shared this preoccupation with Durkheim, who was a kind of psychoanalyst of society and a sociologist of persons. But his perspective allowed us really to conceptualize the person as opposed to the individual, and really understanding the idea that the individual and the society were two sides of the same coin as manifest in the person. And Durkheim carried this. Now, for me, the Durkheim problem was very important and was really part of my formation for the next 10 or 15 years. And sort of putting it very, very simply, I mean, Durkheim's work is enormously complex and many, many books, and you almost have to have the whole corpus in mind, the whole project, in order to pick up those various emphases. But fundamentally, what he identified was that the curious, almost ironic, but certainly structural contradiction in the industrialization process was that the structure of work, the division of labor and the economy, and even the political systems unleashed the enormous potential for the improvement of living standards and productivity. It didn't do distribution much good, but it certainly allowed enormous productivity that would trickle down in one way or another to higher levels of consumption. The dilemma being, the irony, it makes it too funny to call it just an irony, but the trauma of it was that the structure of work also made it impossible for people to feel satisfied with their achievements and the rewards of their achievements for very long. And a process was set in motion through pathogenic and pathological identifications that levels of normative expectation constantly rose, so that the nature of relationships, human relationships in the workplace and in connection with production were such that there was a chronic and sometimes acute illusion of a sense of deprivation and disappointment and disillusionment that would run completely in an intertwined and parallel way with this increased production. And the consequence of what sociologists then were calling feeling relative deprivation, which we could put in other ways, but that's a kind of simplified way of talking about a basket of of almost psychotic anxieties with social manifestations to them. That what was happening was that the response to it, the forms of adjustment, a response to these intense and widespread patterns of discontent, was crowd formation. And there was nothing more frightening to the French power structure than crowd formation. And the origins of our study of large groups goes back to the French sociological preoccupation, well, the Italian too, with crowd formation, which meant a kind of politicization that people were not available for patterns of social control, would not necessarily fit into the structured ways of working, and therefore were a source of chronic instability in a society. That was the ultimate Durkheimian problem. So in a way, he was studying the effects of social trauma on patterns of discontent and the manifestation of these patterns of discontent in large group formations. And there was a way in which this was not the case in German sociology, a la Weber and Marx, I suppose. They were fully aware of these things. The Communist Manifesto in some ways touches on similar problems, and certainly Weber's work touches on the various problems with power structures. But as a matter of emphasis, it was Durkheim who really focused on crowd formation and the study of large groups in that context. Now, ironically, to sort of bring my remarks in a little bit, to rein myself in, it was Freud who began to write in an interesting way about these crowd formations with the famous book on masses. And yet, understandably, Freud emphasized the study of leadership and of persons who would find themselves in so-called leadership roles. We all know what Freud had to say about different patterns of, well, really what was later called pathological narcissism. But basically his interest was in terms of the leader of the large group, not in the large group as such. Now, the history of the work following Freud, I don't know who you want to start with, but you have Adorno on authoritarian personality structures, Arendt on totalitarian personality structures, and there were others, Boles, and I suppose I, at the same time that Kit was writing, because we were siblings, on the fascist state of mind. And there continued to be other formulations. Ultimately, Kernberg and Kohut would talk about disordered and sense of entitlement, but didn't necessarily label it in terms of a particular personality structure. And Kernberg would reconsider pathological narcissism, Chasquet Smirgal with their emphasis on perverse structures. In one way or another, there was this sequence pretty much with people saying the same thing about the leaders, but not about the group formations themselves. Now, it was in that context that in a way that Rickman and Bion and Turkey began to work. I think I accept what Carla said about my formulation, and I didn't think that they could get beyond three basic assumptions because they privileged envy more or less as an instinctual biological phenomenon. And that's really where Fuchs's work came in. He insisted from the beginning that we focus on the social and cultural and power structures of large group formations in the context of wider society phenomenon, and de-emphasized the structure of the leader's personality. And that was, in our field, something really quite remarkable, because as a psychoanalyst, he was saying, I can see that sociology is very important. We have to consider the reality of social facts. This cannot be reduced simply to the study of persons. And this emphasis was very important. My own work then followed because I was then Fuchs and Demare emphasized, therefore, social trauma. And my work, I was desperately concerned with trying to integrate what Fuchs and Demare were therefore saying with what Bion and Turkey were saying. And that's where the study of incohesion came into play. And I accept, actually, I recognize what I've written. I've written the same thing over and over again with slight differences, I think improving it. But I recognize what myself and what Carla said about incohesion, aggregation, massification. And it was a privilege to contribute a few pages to her book. But let me go on just for a moment and add something to that. Not many people in Europe since maybe 1968 or 1969, and I see one or two people here who I may have marched with in Grosvenor Square many years ago, or certainly we have many mutual friends. Not many of us have been really in a crowd or in a mass. We haven't. And my first experience was probably in Grosvenor Square, where I really, for the first time, knew what a mass was. Another experience, though, was in Buenos Aires, which made Grosvenor Square look like a kindergarten or a sandpit. I was in a big square, and people were celebrating the return of various people who had been disappeared and released from prison, and a sea change in the political structure of Argentina. We were in an enormous square, listening to music and people speaking. I know I looked around, I had a few friends near me, and I had this sense that I, Earl Hopper, was not there. I was so much a part of the flesh and blood and the mentality of the people around me that I lost myself. I was really in a mass. This went on for a long period of time. It was rather frightening. But suddenly, in the sky above us, there were a half dozen helicopters with enormous floodlights shining down onto the square, onto the people. And suddenly, all around us, on all of the buildings around the square, were very intense floodlights, and you could see people with machine guns and so on next to it. Within, I would say, 60 seconds, time, of course, also, I can't tell you how many seconds, because time takes on a different meaning in this kind of psychotic loss of self and a recovery of one's sense of self from a merger. Suddenly, I don't know, 10,000 people became silent and left the square. Within a few minutes, there was nobody left. Now, I would say the first experience, part of that was of massification, in which I lost myself. In the second experience, I would say that this was aggregation, in which there was plenty of self, but not much group. There was no group left. But in each case, there was a kind of depersonalization and an imbalance that had established itself in the context of fear. That's what aggregation, massification, aggregation is all about. I'll never forget that experience. Now, to bring this to a conclusion, that kind of my work since then has involved another step, and I'll just name it. We talk about it in the book, Carla, written about it, Carla's book. Actually, I've written something about it in a book that's being edited by Avi Berman and Gila Ofer, who are here, on intolerance. And my concern, since that early formulation of aggregation and massification, is that massification rests on twin pillars. It doesn't just come into being and stay there. It's a highly fragile process, and it rests on the twin pillars of fundamentalism and scapegoating. Fundamentalism involves the sacralization of core values and the power structures who maintain them. It's characterized by social category thinking and feeling. Scapegoating involves the marginalization, peripheralization, and sacrifice of those people who do not fall in to the fundamentalist process. The twin pillars of massification, fundamentalism and scapegoating. And this can be found in our global social system, in our societies right now, and in many of our organizations, particularly in the mental health field, where for various reasons, they can be considered as traumatized organizations, in my opinion. If you think about the United Kingdom, at any rate, in the 1960s, there may have been 5 psychoanalytical training organizations in the entire United Kingdom, maybe more, depending on how you define it and where they were. If you wanted help giving up cigarettes, you'd have to go 5 or 6 times a week to a psychoanalyst, and the charges were more than a university lecturer could make in a year. Today, there must be 175 training organizations. At that time, although women were very important in psychoanalysis in the UK, most of the imagery, apart from Melanie Klein and Anna Freud, was of men, psychiatrists, some of whom wore monocles and boots, one or two, they were immigrants. Today, the project, the psychoanalytical project, is probably a feminist project. And it's no longer a male psychiatry project. Actually, that's a curious source of trauma and dislocation and helplessness. But we can talk about that. At any rate, in my view, constructed large groups, working with them, studying them, experiencing them, is still an extremely useful way for understanding some of these processes, which are not necessarily unique to large constructed groups. They occur in other formations, but working with large groups gives us a chance to understand those processes much better. And I commend that work to you. And in the service of that work, I definitely commend this book, Carla's new book, and I'm sure it will find its way onto the reading lists of many training organizations in many countries. So congratulations, Carla, and I'm pleased to have worked with you for the last few years, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Earl. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
no,
very much.
just going to say that I'm sure lots of you have lots of questions and things you want to ask both Carla and Elle about for such rich talks. So please do write your question in the chat box or raise your hand and we can have you talk to us, which would be lovely. As Elle said, do show us who you are. There's already a new message. Okay, we can start with this question. So this is a question from Sally, who's wondering about the exhilaration of being in a mass or large group.
Could you say more, Sally? You don't have to write. Come on.
Yeah. Yes. What I was just thinking of is the big crowds at the moment in France, say, resisting the pension age going up. And when I look at those crowds, I think of the exhilaration of being the sense of power and being able to have a voice. So I was just wondering how you thought about that. In other words, I sort of feel the big demonstration is the way we can change things. People need to be on the street.
Yes, I think this is something that I wrote something about it in epilogue because Judith Butler she wrote much about the assemblies and these kind of manifestations. I think that we are in the 21st century getting to another form of collective movements, which is the possibility of people being or of social identities and people in general being heard and heard through masses, through crowds. So I think this is another phenomenon that we should explore and try to understand, because what I realized that when I was writing this book and I started my research also in Brazil, as if each century, each moment, the crowds or the masses, they are so connected with the context, so connected with the psychosocial and the political atmosphere, that in a way they mirror what is happening in the world. So it's something for us to keep on writing and building. Tom, do you want to say your question?
Yes, just to say, I immediately think about the times I've been in concerts where I can see the message. Sure, I can understand the two pillars that Earl was talking about. I mean, I'm particularly fond of the Grateful Dead, and it's very much a communication between friends, I suppose. I haven't got really much to comment on.
Okay, it's a comment.
Carla, can I ask a question?
Yes, Raluca, please.
Yes, so I think our colleague Norman Gabriel has a question. Yeah, so
Yes.
Please, Norman.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's nice to see you. And it's also nice to meet Earl, as I was saying earlier to Raluca, who I've heard about at some of the Allies conferences over the years. I'm a bit intrigued because I think both of you mentioned a historical perspective. And I think when we say a historical perspective, we really need to periodize the different societies in which we're in. So I think one way of doing that, and I think it's really helpful, apart from some of the work you've mentioned, both of you realize, is on the civilizing process. And the reason I mention that is some of you will be familiar, but it's Elias's attempt to trace very briefly from the Middle Ages up until today and onwards. And obviously people, as you probably know, Carla and Earl and others have worked on that. The sort of, I suppose we could say, the Elysian group of scholars across the world. So, but my point about the civilizing process, we could briefly say external, a movement towards external regulation, towards self-regulation. But interestingly enough, in some of the countries I've been at with Elias, it links to one way in what Earl was saying, what you were saying, to understand even what's going on today. When Earl was talking about fundamentalism and scapegoating, right? And one of the main points, and sorry for this being too Elysian specific, but I hope it can raise and I can widen it out, is that Elias wrote a book called Establishing Outsiders. Mm-hmm. And Establishing Outsiders is very, people treat that, and you can't do this in Elias's work. You have to be relational all the way through. And I know that obviously from people here, you know, who are analysts, as Earl and others and others here are, which is great. And so what I'm suggesting is that there's a direct relational link between civilizing processes and establishing outsiders. In other words, where the dominant people, whoever they are, right, whether it's male hegemony, whether it's hegemony of particular social classes. But my point is that the way we have to see it, then it gets more complicated. Final point is it's not either alienation versus identification. In other words, we have processes towards more identification with others. Okay, so the late 60s and 70s was more identification with civil rights movements, more identification with Martin Luther King and civil rights. But, and this is important, what we're seeing now is, and I know it doesn't fit totally, but it's decivilizing processes. In other words, disidentification with others, right? But what's difficult to really hold and contain and understand, and for me, I wouldn't say certain, but I'm moving along this line, is we have two parallel processes. We have a movement towards people, sometimes, and it doesn't do it, obviously, from what I'm saying, cultural wars, but I'm kind of reinterpreting cultural wars. We have a movement that has, we could say, sometimes called the formalized process by Cass Footers, who I'll talk about another time. But anyway, so we've got more identification that's happened in the last 30, 40 years. And now maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, or maybe it depends. It's not important how we put a specific year on it, but it's more important, as Elias would say as well, to see overall historical long-term trends. And that's very difficult, because then, when you said, Errol, when you said about social and mental health in individuals and groups, obviously, if you've got these two large-scale processes impinging on groups of individuals in different societies who are also increasingly linked up, then of course it creates incredible amount of social, psychological, and political and economic problems.
Well, I don't know about the problems. You could also say changes. You could say tensions towards constructive resolution and further development. I think you would agree with me on that. But you know, of course I was in Leicester, and I knew that particular study very, very well. I was even a little bit involved in it in Market Harborough, other parts around Leicester. And it is a neglected part of Elias's work, but it is at the same time, in its structure, a rather minor piece of work, but its importance is neglected, and I appreciate your bringing it in. I think that, just to underline quickly your main points, that one of the great problems in the civilizing process as a book, you know, it's a great contribution, yeah, but one of the great problems is that it doesn't capture the progression, regression quality of the movement. Even its name indicates almost it was a book of its time, a kind of continuing progression in a way. Not that Elias would use the word progress, but he didn't give enough attention, I'm sure you'd agree, to the kinds of social trauma that could lead to a collapse of a civilization process, i.e. Nazi Germany. And most of the post-war work of Elias was spent saying to himself and to us as his students, in a way, how is it possible that I didn't formulate this in a way that allowed for such a thing as a Nazi development as a regressive movement?
Okay. Oh, sorry, Errol, just to say that, I think that's so right. But then there's another book called, I think he thought, but then there's another book called The Germans. And that was his attempt, just as you're saying, to look at de-civilizing processes. Because I think you're right, then he realized that he didn't pay enough attention to, you know, processes that can go in reverse. By the way, I just thought about that's very psychoanalytical. In other words, that's his attempt in a social way to look at regression.
Well, but one of the things, I'm sorry to jumping into.
Oh, you should jump.
Yes, but there is a lot, also many questions. And I was thinking, I was listening to you and to you said so many important things, Norman, that I was thinking, well, we always, if we think in figurations or in different possibilities, is as if we were dealing with people who are not familiar with figurations, might be familiar with Wittgenstein's language games. So if we are dealing with so many figurations and so many civilizing processes in terms of progression and regression as we study, and I can put into dialectic spirals from Pichon Riviera from Latin America, I think that we are living in a moment that we are spiraling. Everything is upside down. Multiple figurations are taking place. A huge number of new phenomena are happening, and old phenomena are also happening. People are saying things about trolls, about Anne-Marie said things about Twitter and mobs and how these crowds are present in the Twitter, in the mobs. So in a way, I think that we are, if we use the word trauma, is something that we cannot deal with the capacity. We are dealing with so many processes in parallel, ups and downs, and spiraling around us that we are in a way these, and perhaps we are living so painful and hard times right now because the world is changing so rapid, so that I feel as a Methuselah woman in the middle of so many things. So that's I tried to say.
Thank you, Carla. There's a few questions in the chat that I just want us to make sure that we don't forget these questions.
Exactly.
So Thais asked Carla, could you talk a little bit about how it was for you to conduct or take part in social dreaming, large group dynamics during the COVID pandemic?
Yes, well, it was something that I did from the very beginning of of the pandemic, because it was something that I knew social dreaming makers from the conferences, and I think that it was important from Brazil, and I brought it to Brazil in 2013 for the first time. And I think it was a highly important experience for people who were doing the lockdown. And it was very important for people to be so much connected to dreams, But for me, I think that we live in a world that we don't have space to dream, and we don't have space to see the unconscious process, to get in contact with unconscious process. Even me as a psychoanalyst, when I'm with a client, sometimes I have difficulties to see the unconscious. And in social dreaming, you really get in connection with dreams and the unconscious. It is a royal road for the unconscious. So
I would add to that, if I may,
yes,
that social dreaming matrices often offer an opportunity, even if that's not their main purpose, goal, is the study of massification processes as seen in the merger that people have with one another, such that they dream one another's dreams, and that dreams can, over a course of time, become co-dreamt or co-constructed, thereby indicating something of the regressed merger that people can also feel, which raises all sorts of questions about the nature of identity and identification, some of which is quite regressed and some of which is quite mature. So I just wanted to chip in with that.
But social dreaming is connecting people, I think, much more than large groups. And maybe because of this sharing the same content in different dreams, in different times, but still being together with this.
I would add to Gila what you say, the relationship between social dreaming and large group work, which, for example, we had a panel on the last IEGP conference, is very important. And I think the work is slowly improving from an opposition or some kind of conflict towards more collaboration.
I want to add something about conducting large groups, if I may, because during the last years, I had the possibility of working with large groups during Corona times, which was under the title of COVID, large group connecting many countries. And at the same time, in the last year, I had an experience of conducting large groups of Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, and where Ukraine people and Russian people and people from Europe tried to be together. And it was, for me, it's a very different experience, because conducting large groups through, during the COVID time, really connected people who were isolated, and it brought a lot of very positive experience to the large group. Whereas conducting large groups of under the title of supporting Ukraine, or doing something in connection with the war, Russia and Ukraine, on the one hand connected some people, but it was it brought with it a lot of disconnection, of fights, of people against people, and actually most of the Ukrainians didn't want to stay in those conferences because it contained Russian people, although the Russian people were those who suffered, also who supported Ukraine and really suffered under Putin and didn't know how to even escape Russia at the right time. So it was very interesting to see the difference between large groups under different titles?
Yes, I think one of the things that I noticed, Gila, is that when I felt in love for large groups because it was a passion, that I never felt, I never experienced a large group in the way people in Europe experience. The first large group that I convened was in São Paulo. And there was somebody from Mexico that said this was the most interesting large group that I've been into, because I never felt this way before. So I think that we also, depending on the framework, on the organization, or on the outside context, the large group is somehow contaminated or undermined by this background structure. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you change a bit something, as if you say the name of, you can even convene, even you can host social dreaming matrices with a large number of persons. The experience is different, and the experience of connecting was something that you are writing in this book on tolerance and intolerance. It's experience, because one of the things that I imagine that we should and we need to develop is more tolerance, and learn what is tolerance and what is intolerance, because we are living in a polarized world, and we cannot dialogue. We can even talk with each other anymore if the person thinks a bit different than us. So we close ourselves, and this is the worst thing that might happen.
Carla,
Yeah, but Gila, I'm sorry, just one moment. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I was part of the group, and there is another group of EFPP still trying to go on to try and have some dialogue within the group of international group between Ukrainian and Russian. It's very difficult for the Ukrainian who sit under ongoing war. I mean, you cannot compare their situation to any of us at the moment. Maybe later in time, they would be able to maybe talk. But I also wanted to comment on the power of the crowd. Earl, as you mentioned, this demonstration or big protest that you attended in the cities, we are living now through such a protest in Israel, and just attending this big demonstration, which included a crowd, which I prefer to use, Carla, your metaphor of the firefly. It was indeed like lighting, shining in the darkness of days of togetherness. And it's not as, I didn't feel I lost my individuality. I felt I am connected with many other individuals who are on the good side. There was the feeling of that crowd that happened one Saturday after the other, and it grew bigger and bigger and gained power. And it was an amazing phenomenon in our society, which is still going on. So I just wanted to mention it. Well,
I think that's a very important thing to mention. It's not a casual point, and it connects with Sally's point that I very much agree with and identify with. But there are two aspects of it. It's that optimally regressive experiences in which you find kindred spirits and like-minded folks and so on is very empowering, and it can enhance your sense of individuality. It doesn't have to be a matter of kind of pathological regression, and I think that needs to be said. But there are also crowds and there are crowds, and crowd formation in one country is not exactly the same as in another, and so on. But it pertains to our need to work with individuality and personification of different kinds of co-constructed roles in the groups It's not an either or. So that's one thing. The other thing I just wanted to say, because I know we're going to run out of time. I myself am somewhat ambivalent. I'm not at all certain about the therapeutic value of large group work or social dreaming matrix work. I don't know any alternatives, and I find that they are very often better than nothing. But on the other hand, they are very interesting, very important tools for the study of processes that occur in large groups. Whether or not that can be therapeutic, that is slightly, sometimes rather wishful, and depends, it seems to me, very much on the skills of the conductor, and above all, on the dynamic administration of the project. And very often in our field, people think that you can just put a lot of people together in a room. It will have, if they talk together, it will contribute to the development of the organization, or what Pat Damare would say, the maturation of the group and of the people in it. I don't think so. I don't feel that that's an inevitability. I think that there's a big difference between having an instrument for the study of what goes on in these processes, including pathogenesis and pathology, and actually assuming that they will inevitably be therapeutic. They might be, they can be, and therein lies the tension in the project, it seems to me.
It matters what is therapeutic. We enter in another dimension, another field. What is therapeutic?
Oh, tell us.
I'm gonna have to interrupt and leave us with that large kind of leading question because we are over time. But it's a testament to how interesting and rich both of your talks are, the fact that there's so many discussions going on in the chat and people conversing. So I hope you get a chance to read those. But thank you again so much, Carla and Hopper, Carla and Earl for your talks. And congratulations, Carla, on this important book. And I've left the link again to the book for those of you who want to buy it. But we're honored to have had you talk this evening and give us a glimpse of the books. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think it was so important that we are together, and you see how many questions and ideas and things that people want to share. So we really need to foster these spaces for conversations. And thank you so much, the university, LiPSiC, Earl Hopper, dear Earl, and all who contributed for this, and friends and people that I like and I admire and I learn from. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The book.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Carla. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Recording stopped.